Not everyone is destined to become rich and famous, even if these criteria are considered the main measures of success in many communities. Some people want to be liked at any cost. In the Criminal Chronicles of the United States of America, there is a cruel, enlightening story that shows how far delusion and the desire to fit into a privileged society can go. Kirsten Marina Costas was born on June 23, 1968. Her family, consisting of her mother Berit and her father Arthur, moved to the small town of Orinda, California, even before the children were born. With fewer than 20,000 inhabitants, it was quiet, cozy, and safe, simply the perfect place to raise children. Berit had given birth to 2 children, daughter Kirsten and son Peter. In this town, the family was quite well known. Everyone considered them decent and hardworking people. The Costas were quite wealthy, even by the standards of the local community, which was dominated by high-income individuals. The town was predominantly populated by successful and affluent people. In this community, the girls' parents earned great respect. Everything they owned, they had built with their own work. Arthur worked for a large American company called 3M. He was among the local executives. His wife worked in a community center and also reached a fairly high position. Together, the couple earned a good income and had no trouble supporting a family with 2 children who never lacked anything. The family was an active member of the tennis club and frequently visited the swimming pool. It is evident that Kirsten and her brother Peter had a carefree childhood. They grew up in a friendly, loving family and remained closely bonded siblings from a young age. At the age of 15, Kirsten was a teenager with typical problems. During this time, she attended high school. The girl was sociable, confident, friendly, and athletic. Kirsten trained constantly, was sporty, looked good, and had excellent grades. She had the respect of her teachers and classmates. In fact, Kirsten participated in almost all school sports, from swimming to dancing. She regularly took part and showed great talent. She proved to be incredibly energetic and sociable in life, allowing her to gather a large number of friends around her. She dressed colorfully and unusually, combining different styles, and many tried to imitate her. In the summer of 1984, Kirsten had just finished her second year at high school. During the summer holidays, she found out that there was a cheerleading squad. The girl was smart, charismatic, and athletically successful, the perfect cheerleader. Kirsten was very popular at school, and she really liked this additional opportunity to prove herself. Together with a friend, she applied to become a member of the cheerleading group, but the 20-member committee chose Kirsten. The selection process was very serious, and it was not easy for her to win. This was because the girl also trained a lot at home and did everything she could to secure a place on the team. The family supported Kirsten. Her parents paid additional contributions to the cheerleading team's fund, bought uniforms, and helped her in every possible way. However, this new team was not as welcoming as it first seemed. All the girls in the cheerleading group came from wealthy families, and during this time, there was a kind of competition among the participants. The richer you were, the better. Thanks to her parents' wealth, Kirsten had no problem with this issue. She seemed to fit in effortlessly. But there were still some tensions among the girls. Kirsten was not only accepted into the cheerleading group, but also into the school's sorority, a privileged club for the most popular, beautiful, and wealthy girls. Amid all these positive changes that Kirsten perceived as positive, she expected her last year in high school to be as fulfilling and interesting as possible, and she assumed these would be the best years of her life. Kirsten was a 15-year-old teenager who had everything young people at this age dream of. She had a striking appearance, glamour, status, her parents' wealth, popularity, and prospects in all directions. Kirsten had no idea how high the price for all this would be. On the evening of June 23, 1984, a man named Arthur Hillman heard cries for help on the street. At that moment, he was in his house, which was located near the Costas family. When he looked out the window, he saw a girl who was covered with dark spots, stumbling and staggering toward him. She asked for help and was blood-stained. Arthur immediately recognized his neighbor, the 15-year-old Kirsten, and ran to the door. The girl was alive but severely injured. With her last strength, she managed to say that she had been attacked and stabbed multiple times not far from the front door. The attacker had then simply fled. Kirsten did not name the assailant. The girl was bleeding heavily and lost so much blood within minutes that she could practically no longer stand. Arthur ran outside to help, and Kirsten collapsed powerlessly into his arms. The student had lost too much blood from her wounds and could no longer stand. The neighbor, who had known her since childhood, tried to stop the bleeding and called out to his wife to call emergency services. While the wife made the emergency call, Arthur held the dying girl in his arms and provided emergency care. He tried to find out what had happened to his neighbor and who had attacked her, but Kirsten seemed no longer aware of what was happening. She spoke incoherently, repeatedly saying that she couldn't breathe, and then lost consciousness. As it turned out, the girl's parents were not at home at the time of the attack. They were at a baseball game of their son Peter, and later had dinner with his baseball team at a restaurant. The couple and their son returned home only 5 minutes after the attack on Kirsten, and the news came as a surprise to them. By that time, she had already been transported by paramedics in an ambulance. The parents rushed after the vehicle and arrived at the hospital a few minutes later. On the way there, the paramedics provided assistance to the girl. The doctors at the hospital also fought for her life, but it was of no use, and she was declared dead about an hour later. The cause of death was blood loss due to stab wounds. During the autopsy, the coroner found 5 stab wounds on Kirsten's body, 1 in the back and the other stab wounds in the abdomen. The police first decided to talk to the neighbor of the victim, who turned out to be the last person to see the victim alive and had tried to help her. For him and everyone else in his environment, what had happened was a real shock. No one had expected a defenseless girl to be attacked near her home. Their neighborhood had always been quiet and safe. Everyone lived here. Many people didn't even lock their doors. No one would have expected such an attack in their town. They thought it was a satanic act and that the murderer came from outside the town. No one wanted to believe that the attacker came from the area, as that could mean that now all people were in danger. Parents kept their children away from outings and parties, and police officers patrolled the town to reassure the residents. Unfortunately, Arthur did not see the attacker, but as he held the dying Kirsten in his arms, he noticed a white Volvo driving down the street. A few seconds earlier, it had been parked on the curb not far from the victim's house, and that seemed strange to him. The man knew the cars of all the residents in the neighborhood, but this car seemed unfamiliar to him. The police officers suspected that the driver of this car was the murderer. Unfortunately, Arthur could not remember the license plate, but he tried to describe the appearance of the Volvo to the police as accurately as possible. Amazingly, while the officers were questioning the victim's neighbor at the crime scene, a white Volvo stopped at the same spot on the roadside. Arthur recognized it immediately. The driver got out of the car and introduced himself as Alex Arnold. Based on the witness's statement, the police assumed he was the main suspect in the crime. The fact that he appeared again at the crime scene during the investigation seemed strange, and as we know, murderers often return to the crime scene. However, in response to the investigators' questions, the man told an incredible story. According to Alex, that evening, a girl he knew knocked on his house, which was in a neighboring town, and asked to make a phone call. It was Kirsten. They were friends with her parents. Kirsten came to his house and told him that she was walking with a girl she knew, but they had argued, so she decided to go home. The student asked to call her parents. Alex let her into the house, but the girl couldn't reach them because the couple was at a game at that time and there were no cell phones back then. Seeing Kirsten's predicament, Alex couldn't leave her alone and offered to drive her home in his car so she wouldn't have to walk alone late in the evening. She agreed. According to the man, as soon as they left his house, a car began to follow them. It was a yellow Ford Pinto that relentlessly followed them the whole way. Alex asked the girl if she knew the owner of the yellow car that was following them. Kirsten replied that she knew him, but that it wasn't worth worrying about, and she didn't go into details. The man didn't insist. When they arrived at her house, the girl said goodbye to Alex and got out. At that moment, the driver noticed that a yellow Ford Pinto had stopped right behind him. As soon as Kirsten reached the house, a person got out of the yellow car. Alex observed the scene. He couldn't see the face exactly, but he could tell that it was a girl in a yellow shirt and red pants. Kirsten saw her approaching and screamed that she should be left alone. Her attacker, however, had no intention of retreating. She pulled out a large knife and stabbed Kirsten several times in the abdomen. When the victim fell to the ground, the attacker stabbed her again in the back. She then jumped into the yellow car and drove away. According to Arnold, he set off to try to catch up with the car carrying the perpetrator. Alex saw that a neighbor had gone out to help the injured girl and decided that it was more important to catch the murderer. However, since he soon lost sight of her, he decided to return to Kirsten's house to make sure she was okay. By this time, she had already been taken to the hospital, and the police were talking to the victim's neighbor. He decided to make a statement to assist the investigators. After hearing the story, the police initially thought that the man might have invented the story to deflect suspicion from himself. However, his behavior and words seemed convincing enough. He successfully passed a lie detector test and showed no traces of blood. He was eventually removed from the list of suspects. This also happened after checking his phone. Calls had been made from Alex's private number to the Costas' house. There were several witnesses who confirmed that Kirsten had asked him for help. Alex's wife, who was also in the house, confirmed her husband's story. After the failed call, the man drove Kirsten home. It would have been illogical for him to kill her in front of the girl's house and risk being caught by neighbors or possibly the parents when he could have done it safely in his own home. Alex was questioned extensively and was able to describe the attacker as a young girl with blonde hair. He could describe quite in detail what he had seen, giving the police officers guidance to find the perpetrator. Initially, it was decided to check Kirsten's immediate surroundings to find a girl matching her description. Possibly, it was the same acquaintance with whom the victim had argued that evening. The investigators later spoke to the victim's parents and obtained useful information. According to the mother, a week before the attack, while her daughter was attending a cheerleader camp, she received a strange call. A girl called the house and identified herself as Kim. She said she was a leader of the school's cheerleading squad and invited Kirsten to a private sorority party. This party was to take place on June 23rd, and all members of the sorority were to attend. Kirsten was, of course, invited to this event for the most popular teenagers. A car was supposed to pick Kirsten up that evening, and she was not to tell anyone about it. This coincidence seemed strange to the investigators because the murder happened right after the sorority party. The police found out that this invitation was actually a deception. They managed to call most of the cheerleaders, and it turned out that none of them had been invited to the party or had attended it. Moreover, the cheerleader Kim was on vacation in Hawaii at that time, and without her, the party couldn't have taken place. Obviously, she couldn't have called and arranged meetings, so it wasn't Kim who called. Apparently, the invitation was directed only at Kirsten to lure her out and reprimand her. Unfortunately, there was no way to trace the call. The data had already been deleted, which significantly slowed down the investigation. The investigators knew that the call had been made a week before the murder, which meant it was a deliberate, carefully planned attack. The investigators realized that the so-called leader of the sorority, who called the Costas, must have known her victim well and had a motive. Most likely, they went to school together, or the girl also belonged to the cheerleaders and possibly harbored a grudge against the victim. The investigators then began to closely examine Kirsten's immediate surroundings. They questioned dozens of girls and even had several of them take a lie detector test. In conversations with other students, the investigators found that Kirsten was one of the most popular girls at school. They speculated that the murderer might have been an outsider who often harbored hatred towards people like Kirsten and wanted to exact revenge. It was assumed that it was a lonely, rebellious girl who found it difficult to fit into society and was not socialized. Nancy Kane fit this description perfectly. She also went to school with Kirsten and had an unusual sense of style. She dressed in dark colors, dyed her hair, and used aggressive makeup. Other students reported that she often drank and liked to smoke illegal substances. Nancy was an outsider in the class and was often criticized by other students, including Kirsten. Nancy had once been a popular teenager herself, but later admitted that she was bored with the monotonous friends and didn't like the life concepts of these rich girls. Their paths diverged, and others began to avoid her, so she became a loner. The investigators suggested Nancy come in for an interview to ask her some questions, and she appeared at the station. According to Nancy, she had an alibi. She was at the cinema on the evening of the massacre. The girl, however, refused to undergo a lie detector test, and her relatives also strongly opposed this test to avoid traumatizing their daughter's still undeveloped psyche. Father and mother feared that the test could yield a false result due to Nancy's excitement. Despite the validity of these opinions, the investigators became very suspicious of Nancy, who qualified as a suspect. Of course, the investigators believed that the real reason for her refusal to undergo the lie detector test was that Nancy was involved in the attack and was afraid of being exposed. However, there was no solid evidence against her that would have allowed charges to be brought against the main suspect. The investigators decided to release the girl, but did not exclude her as a suspect and began to closely monitor her. In the community, rumors spread that Nancy had threatened Kirsten in class the day before her death and that they had had an argument. The suspect, however, denied this information. Calls from residents threatening her with death came to Nancy's house every evening. Most people believed that Nancy was behind the crime. The suspect became a real outcast, was bullied at school, and her parents were forced to transfer her to another school. Nancy and her parents were having a difficult time at this point. Later, Nancy herself returned to the station and revealed that she had lied to the police officers. According to the student, she was not at the cinema at the time of the attack, but was out with her boyfriend. The girl stated that she was afraid her parents might find out where she really was and ruin her relationship, which is why she didn't tell the truth about her whereabouts in front of her parents. Nancy's boyfriend confirmed her alibi. The young man admitted to the investigators that he met with Nancy in the evening and that they were together until late at night. The investigators were therefore forced to exclude her as a possible perpetrator. The investigation continued, but there were no visible progress. The police questioned dozens of teenagers and even offered a reward for information leading to the capture and punishment of the murderer, but all this had no effect. Months passed without results. Therefore, the district police decided to turn to the FBI. The agents participated in the investigation into Kirsten's murder. Their task was to create a psychological profile of the murderer that the police officers could compare with the girls from the deceased's close circle. The FBI assumed that the murderer was about the same age as the victim. They assumed that she lived near Kirsten and was familiar with the area, allowing her to evade pursuit. The girl must have harbored a strong grudge against the victim, which was the reason for the attack. The agent was sure that the perpetrator felt no remorse for what had happened and believed that Kirsten deserved such punishment. After the police had checked all the girls from the victim's environment, suspicion fell on Bernadette Prati, a student from the same class as the victim. She was 16 years old at the time of the crime. Both girls were part of an active community, but Kirsten was considered the most popular at school, while Bernadette only aspired to belong to the privileged youths and was very jealous of the deceased. Several months had passed since the investigation began when the victim's parents hired a private detective. The mother and father were eager to find out what had happened to their daughter and were dissatisfied with the slow progress of the investigation. This initiative quickly bore fruit. The hired detective analyzed all the data the police had collected and found the girl who most closely matched the police's description and the witness Alex. It was the private detective who first suspected Bernadette Prati of being involved in the massacre. As it turned out, Bernadette was one of the first to be contacted by the police at the beginning of the investigation. She actively participated in the investigation and even passed a lie detector test. The police believed that Bernadette had passed the test, but the private detective found the results inconclusive. Bernadette stated that on the day of the murder, she was working as a babysitter on the side and was watching the children of a family she knew. She occasionally worked as a babysitter and was asked to watch the children that evening and even stay the whole night. As it turned out, the police had never verified Bernadette's alibi and simply let her go home. When the private detective decided to check this information with the girl's parents, he found out that she had lied. Bernadette had referred to a family with children she hadn't worked with for over a year, and they themselves denied the student's statement. Of course, this lie became a reason for new suspicions. She had something to hide. The girl automatically became the main suspect. In December 1984, Bernadette was questioned again at the police station based on a tip from the private detective. 6 months had passed since the investigation began. The high school student perfectly matched the murderer's profile. The girl did not deny that she really knew the victim and had even met with her the night before the attack, but did not confirm the investigators' suspicion that she had attacked the victim. It is known that Bernadette, along with other classmates, even attended Kirsten's funeral. Witnesses reported that the girl cried there, but in reality, it was all just an act necessary to deflect any suspicion from the police. The investigators needed solid evidence to charge the suspect. Forensic examinations were far from modern capabilities at that time. There were no DNA tests. Bernadette was interrogated repeatedly in the hope that the murderer would confess, but the teenager could never be broken, so the police were forced to let her go and once again stood empty-handed. The investigation seemed to have reached a dead end. No physical evidence could be found linking the student to the attack. The sheriff's team checked thousands of leads, questioned 800 people, and examined 750 Ford Pinto cars. Fortunately, the interrogations were more effective than they seemed. In fact, Bernadette appeared very confused and frightened, which encouraged her to share her worries with someone. The girl struggled with this for a few days and then decided to confess to her devout parents. At first, she wanted to confess everything to her mother in a personal conversation, but she chose an unfortunate time. In the evening, her mother replied that she was tired and didn't want to listen to her daughter. So Bernadette decided to write a letter. The girl handed it to her parents in the morning and left the house with the note that it should be read half an hour later. The parents had no idea what was really going on, so they actually waited 30 minutes, assuming it was some kind of game. When Bernadette's mother opened the envelope, the letter contained a confession. "Mom and Dad, I did it," followed by a brief explanation of the act and an apology. The girl wrote that she hated herself and needed help. The parents were, of course, shocked. The mother and father then got into the car and were able to find their daughter when she was already halfway to school. The parents decided to do the right thing, put Bernadette in the car, and drove her to the nearest police station, where the student repeated her confession to the officers and admitted everything. The high school student confessed that she had organized and carried out the murder of her friend. Bernadette had faked a meeting to lure her into a trap. However, she admitted that she did not intend to kill her. Rather, the girl just wanted to talk to Kirsten and get closer to her. Bernadette dreamed of being just as popular and decided to befriend Kirsten. The girl didn't make it into the cheerleading squad, the sorority, or even into the school's schedule, so she was determined to change that. On the evening of June 23, 1984, she took her parents' yellow Ford and said she urgently needed to go to a friend's children. In this way, Bernadette tried to create an alibi to be away for the whole night. She then drove to Kirsten's house and picked her up in her car. The unsuspecting Kirsten got into the car. Bernadette deceived her supposed victim by telling her they were on their way because she had also been accepted into the popular cheerleading community and needed a ride. In reality, Bernadette drove to a neighboring town. The girl drove to a nearby parking lot near a church and stopped on the side so that her car was in the shade. A confused Kirsten tried to figure out what was going on and why they had driven in the other direction. Then, Bernadette confessed that there would be no party. She pulled out some illegal substances and offered to smoke them. Contrary to expectations, Kirsten refused. She didn't take substances and began to get angry. An argument broke out between the girls. According to Bernadette, her friend demanded that she be taken home. This whole ridiculous situation only made Kirsten angrier. She wasn't happy about it, and such an extravagant way of making friends through abduction seemed strange to her. Kirsten said so. The whole thing with the fake party appeared completely inappropriate and inexplicable to her, so she lost her temper and simply left. She wanted to get home alone. In this way, the victim reached Alex, who helped the student and took her in his car. All the while, they were followed by Bernadette, who, according to her, wanted to see how her classmate would get home. The murderer admitted that she had gone after Kirsten because she was afraid that her failed friend might tell the school about her unusual attempt at friendship. She would be seen as strange and ridiculed by everyone. That was a real catastrophe for the teenager. She desperately wanted to belong to the popular girls along with Kirsten and not become the object of ridicule. The girl was so frightened that she couldn't find a better way to solve this problem than to get rid of Kirsten. From the murderer's words, it emerged that she did her best to please Kirsten and gain her approval and support. She invented a fake party so they could spend time together and even brought illegal substances, which she thought would bring them together. In this way, according to Bernadette's plan, she would prove to Kirsten how well she could fit into their circle of friends. The student dreamed of climbing up the class hierarchy and becoming popular, so she made great efforts, but she obviously overdid it, and this absurd idea only worsened the situation. Bernadette had always envied Kirsten. No matter what she did, the student proved to be inferior to Kirsten. The envy and jealousy grew over the years and eventually culminated in a bloody tragedy. After the murder, Bernadette returned home, hid the knife in the garden, and went for a walk with her mother and dog. The next day, she washed the knife and returned it to the kitchen. Later, the girl threw her shirt and pants into a trash can near the school. There were numerous witnesses who confirmed the FBI agent's statements. Bernadette indeed harbored a strong grudge against her victim and had a motive. Many students at the school repeatedly observed how Kirsten admonished Bernadette and even occasionally mocked her. Both seemed to talk friendly with each other, but Kirsten occasionally called her a wannabe. All this offended the girl. Bernadette's family was much poorer than Kirsten's. The suspect's parents were already retired and couldn't afford many things. All this only made matters worse. The murderer claimed she had no evil intentions when she began preparing her plan. She just wanted to make contacts and befriend Kirsten. She had to lure the victim out of the house under some pretext. She just wanted to talk and build a friendship, and only when the situation got out of control did Bernadette panic and eventually stab her classmate. She emphasized that it was not a premeditated murder, but the result of an unfortunate chain of circumstances. However, this story had at least one inconsistency. How could Bernadette get her hands on a knife over 40 centimeters long? Such a weapon cannot accidentally end up in the girl's hands. This suggests that Bernadette may not have intended to kill Kirsten immediately, but had considered this possibility and prepared for a possible murder. The case was tried in court in March 1985. The prosecution disputed the murderer's statement and believed that the attack was carefully planned. All the lies about the invented party, the attempt to lure Kirsten out of the house, the large butcher knife that somehow accidentally ended up in the perpetrator's car, all these facts pointed to deliberate action. Bernadette had clearly planned the murder long in advance. The defendant's lawyer insisted on an unintentional act. The student countered the prosecutor by saying she used the knife to peel fruit in her car, which she loved and often bought. This argument, of course, seemed doubtful, as it's not very practical to use such a large knife, normally used for cutting meat, to peel fruit. Either way, the prosecution failed to convincingly prove the intent for murder. The jury decided that the student was guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Since the girl was still a minor at the time of the crime, she received only 9 years in a juvenile detention center. According to her lawyer, juveniles convicted of murder in California serve an average sentence of 4 to 6 years. Bernadette served 7 years of her stated sentence before being released on parole in 1992. By this time, she was 23 years old. Naturally, Kirsten's family was outraged by such a mild punishment for the brutal attack on their daughter. By this time, the murderer had already graduated from high school, passed her exams, and even received a diploma. She had a whole life ahead of her, which Kirsten was no longer granted. After her release, Bernadette changed her name and moved to another state, far away from malicious gossip. She married and had 2 children. Today, Bernadette is in her 50s and has lived the full life she had denied her classmate. The Costas family left Orinda and moved to Hawaii. They were never able to appeal the conviction and obtain a harsher sentence for the perpetrator. They still believe that the murderer of their daughter got off lightly. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.